So we are delighted to have Sinem today presenting her work. So Sinem, please go ahead. And Sinem is happy to be interrupted during her talk. So don't be shy and ask any questions, apparently, even the substantive one during the talk.
Thank you so much, Helene. As Helene mentioned, please do interrupt me. I'm on single screen. I won't be able to monitor the chat or hands. If you have questions, I'm more than happy to be interrupted. And let me start by thanking the seminar series for inviting me today here to present my work with two friends from Bank of England, Sylvia and Christina. And we currently call our work When Creativity Strikes, News Shocks and Business Cycle Fluctuations. And given we all three are affiliated with the Bank of England, the usual disclaimer applies that these are our own views and not the Bank of England's. So in this talk, we're going to be talking about business cycle fluctuations and how a particular type of shock affects business cycle fluctuations. But to get you started, here we go. To get you started, we are focusing on a hypothesis called news-driven business cycles, because what sets off business cycles has been a story that has been researched by many scholars. And this one, particularly news-driven business cycles, actually go back to early 90s with Pigot and Keynes. And what does that say? It gives a central role on expectations. And it specifically says, if we receive favorable news about future fundamentals, that could create a boom, while lower than expected realized fundamentals can set off a bust. Please pay attention to the wording here, because it doesn't say anything about anything really happening to future fundamentals itself. It is talking about role of expectations and how we place our expectations in accordance with what we expect future fundamentals to be. That basically implies that business cycles can arise even if there are no changes in fundamentals. This is what the hypothesis says. And clearly, this has many different aspects. News could be about many things, and people attack this question from many different angles. And while they were doing that, everybody realized that the empirical plausibility of this hypothesis is still an open question, because it's very hard to show these kind of abstract concept of expectations setting business cycles is very hard empirically. We are approaching it from only one angle. So in the sides of the debate, we are taking the side of technological change and productivity. So we are going to focus on technological news shocks, technology news shocks, and if they would be actually changing future productivity. So the arrival of new shocks on technology, that some technological innovation will happen in the future, if they have a role to play in changing productivity from today onwards, even if we are expecting something to happen in the future. And there are two broad views. This is not a topic that nobody so far investigated. Many people investigated it. And there are two broad views. On the one hand, there are many people who argue in favor of it. And on the other hand, there are many people, very important academics and scholars, who don't agree with this hypothesis. And in the heart of the debate, there are two dimensions. The first one is that if we're talking about business cycles, we expect some co-movement in particular variables. And normally people look at consumption and hours. And when a shock hits, how these two variables interact and co-move, or if they co-move or not. Depending on how you're attacking this question, you're going to see that sometimes some papers find that consumption and hours move in the same direction together, but in some cases they move in opposite directions. And on the other side, people focus on what are the share of business cycle fluctuations accounted by these new shocks. If you're constantly focusing on technology new shocks, when technology shocks hit, what is the share of business fluctuations accounted by these shocks? And depending on, again, how you approach this question, you might have widely different answers. And in the heart of this debate, the disagreements are coming from many different angles. The first one, for example, is strong identifying assumptions in the past studies. Again, let me remind you that this is a very abstract concept of understanding the role of expectations in setting business cycles. And in this case, we understand that earlier studies clearly had to make very strong identifying assumptions. For example, in the first one, Baudry and Portier 2006 paper is going to be one of my favorite ones to cite in this presentation. They assume that the new shocks is orthogonal to current productivity. So exogenous exogeneity of the technological progress is key for their identification. And on the other hand, some other studies had to assume that new shocks are the long-run drivers of technology. For example, technology shocks are those that maximize the forecast error variance decomposition of productivity in some finite horizon. And these are strong, but back then definitely necessary assumptions to make. On the other hand, some of the disagreement is coming from strong modeling assumptions. For example, if it's a very simple thing, but if you set your VAR in first differences versus levels, you might get widely different answers to this abstract question. And this has been explored by many, or sometimes you cannot really get away from using co-integrating variables in your VAR. And they do create quite a lot of problems in your models to get to the answer you're looking for. And coupled with the modeling assumptions, also with identifying assumptions, sometimes you have to work with very small VARs as the data generating process. For example, Baudry and Portier 2006 paper has only two variables, the total factor productivity, TFP, and the stock market index. And that you need to make a very big assumption that this VAR is representative of the economy you work with, but clearly we know that that might not be the case. And this last point also brings me to the third origin of disagreement, which is strong informational assumptions. If we can only use 2 or 3 or very small number of variables in our VARs due to identifying or modeling assumptions we have to make, the informational sufficiency of your VAR is not enough. And that was already explored by a large literature by itself, informational sufficiency in VARs. And that also brings along some other issues in the theory part of VARs, for example, non-invertibility and non-fundamentalness. If you're not very familiar with non-fundamentalness, it's when agents are able to participate future changes. That basically arises when your VAR is not informationally sufficient, because that means that current realizations are only informative about past shocks that agents were expected back in the day. And that violates your assumptions and therefore is problematic. In some cases, many, again, smart people, for example, in the follow-up work in 2014 by Baudry Portier, they show that their results don't widely change, but there is definitely some distortion on some parameters they would like to look at in this particular concept, changes when there's non-fundamentalness, meaning if the VAR is not informationally sufficient. So given equipped with all these that I mentioned to you, that we are looking at news-driven business cycles, there have been very strong assumptions, and therefore, due to what kind of modeling or identifying assumption you take, people ended up with widely different results, and therefore there is a branch of literature that don't agree with it versus some people agree with it. And here, in this paper, we attempt to come up with...
Can I just ask?
Yes, of course, please.
No, I was just wondering, so you focus on news specifically about technology.
Yeah.
Is there any reason for that? So, for example, isn't there also parallel literature which would be on news about, fiscal policy, news about monetary policy, news about other things, and are the, let's say, the debate or the results kind of similar to what is going on with that literature on news about technology, or not?
So the reason why we particularly focus on technology news shocks is because of the instrument we came up with to identify those. So in a way, we found the solution and then we defined the problem afterwards, if that is an answer. There is definitely quite a big link between us and different type of news shocks, like anticipated and unanticipated news shocks, for example. But in our case, given finding an instrumental variable is already quite difficult, when we were looking at the literature by sheer luck, we realized that we can actually use, I don't want to spoil what the instrumental variable is because it's going to be at the end of the slide, but we found this instrument that would work for technology news shock. But I'm sure a similar thing, has been already done for other types of news shocks as well. Now I can actually tell everybody what the instrument is, and that hopefully is going to eliminate some of the suspense. So given I have told you about this story of strong many assumptions and people who argue in favor or against it in this hypothesis, what we are bringing on the table is a novel identification of technology news shocks by using an instrumental variable. And the question we ask is how does the aggregate economy react to a shock, that raises expectations about future productivity growth? And once we ask this question, we are going to be looking at the dynamic responses of macroeconomic and financial variables. And I'm going to talk to you about it very regularly in the rest of the talk, that this IV, while we ask this question, enables us to dispense from almost all the classical identifying assumptions that were made back in the literature. And the intuition behind the IV is quite simple. I hope you agree with me. Please shout if you don't. We think most, if not all, future technological innovations have to be patented at some point. I'm sure you all know that, the computer chips, cars, phones we use up to some extent, maybe not the final product, but the ingredients to these technological innovations do have some sort of patenting process in place. We can discuss whether patenting process is a very efficient process or it is the most productive way of fostering technological innovation. That is, I'm more than happy to take that discussion especially in the breakout rooms later. But we think that the patenting process itself includes some sort of news about technological innovation. And what is important here is we're talking about patent applications, not granted patents. So when you apply for a patent, when you develop XYZ product, that application gives the economy a sense of news about what is about to come. And while you are developing your product, you can clearly maybe eliminate some of the news component of this application process, but there is some, maybe with a big error, there is some news component in patent applications. This is what we are going to use as an IV in our work. But there is one very important point that I would like to mention. Clearly, if we are in a boom, firms can allocate more on R&D, and therefore they can actually produce more products and therefore more patents. So by accounting, we need to account for that. And to be able to account for this, we're using the unforecastable, the exogenous variation in patent applications as an instrumental variable for technology news. And I will tell you how we construct this instrumental variable in a second. While we're thinking about this unforecastable component of patent applications, clearly we are still in the IV world, right? And IVs, instrumental variables, need to obey with some rules. And the first one is that it needs to be a relevant instrument, which in the current context means that it needs to be informative about future technological changes. And we think we have this. Although I only cite 3 papers here, there is a large literature, not just an economics literature, but generally a productivity literature that links patents to general purpose technology, GPT. So we think we don't have to really worry about how relevant the patenting process is for technology news. But on the other hand, it needs to be exogenous to pre-existing beliefs and the macroeconomy. And as I just mentioned, if we're in a boom and if we have more money to allocate to R&D, we might not have that because we might be producing more patents in a cyclical way. So we don't think we have the second bit. And that's why in the construction of the instrument, we will be controlling for preformed expectations and other shocks to purge patent applications, to clean it from this kind of endogeneity. Before going on to the instrument construction, I just wanted to tell you the following. Clearly, we will have a VAR and we will have an instrumental variable to identify this one shock, the technology news shocks that we're interested in. But this is actually nothing different than having a bit of a smart way of setting a VAR and identifying it with Cholesky ordering that we are generally all familiar with. And in this case, if you focus on the first 3 variables in this list, our way of using an IV in the VAR boils down to putting patent applications after contemporaneous policy changes that we are going to control for and pre-existing applications. And then afterwards, putting the other variables of interest, for example, TFP and other variables that we care for, underneath. So the patent applications are themselves are endogenous, that are pre-cleaned in the VAR. Why don't we do this and do the simple Cholesky ordering, but actually use a proxy VAR, which is a two-stage thing that I'm going to talk to you about? It's because we have different time spans for the VAR variables that we consider and the instrumental variable we have. And proxy VAR gives us the flexibility to use different sample sizes in the empirical methodology. And once we do that, once we use our purged patent application data and make an IV out of it and use it in the VAR to isolate this one shock, what we find is that some of the assumptions in the past literature instead become our results, because we don't have any assumptions on how TFP should react if new shocks are orthogonal to current productivity. We don't take any stands on whether or not technology new shocks are those that are the long-run drivers of TFP. But these assumptions that were made in past studies instead become our results. And what we find is that TFP doesn't move much on impact. Actually, I'll show you that it starts moving significantly after 4 to 6 years' time, but it rises with a delay. And what we observe also is that this shock, the new shock that we identify, drives definitely long-run TFP and has very limited impact on the short-term TFP. And in addition to these, for other variables, what we find is that we observe some business cycle type movements, in the sense of, for example, consumption and hours move on the same direction. And these variables already start moving in anticipation of the TFP rise. Although TFP doesn't move much in the beginning, the business cycle already is set off by this kind of shock. And these shocks explain sizable share of fluctuations in the business cycle frequencies for different variables that we consider in the VAR. And we also observe that there's some heterogeneity in response of agents' expectations. When I say agents here, I'm basically talking about how financial markets react, how financial markets and the macroeconomy react to these shocks versus how consumers react to it. But I will talk to you about these when we talk about the larger VAR results. I will definitely now go through the slide, but I wanted to leave you with a few references for the relevant technology, the relevant literature, which is massive. And this is by no means a comprehensive list. It is composed of papers on technology and technology news, patent data as measures of technology changes, and different measures of technology new shocks. Clearly, patents are not the only one. For example, this giant oil discoveries or book publications on technology field have been already used as direct measures of technology new shocks.
Sinem?
Hi, Eleonora.
Yes, hi. Sorry, may I ask you a question?
Yes, of course, please do.
Did anybody use text analysis as measure of technology news shocks, from looking at media publications, for example?
Not that I'm aware of. The only thing that I can think that is mildly close to that is these book publications, Eleonora, by Alexa Poulos. I think this is an AR paper in 2011. She goes to the library and she just basically counts the number of books that were published in technology, but not that I'm aware that there is a paper that does text analysis to get to technology shocks or technology new shocks.
Thanks, because I was just thinking that maybe, by the time a technology is patented, it might not be so much of a news.
No, I completely agree. That's so in the patenting process, generally until the application, your innovation is quite a secret. And actually, I will talk to you about some regulation changes. Until some regulation changes happened, even after the patent application, your product is quite opaque and it's protected behind closed doors. However, once it is granted, clearly the news component completely disappears. So there is, although that's why we're also using patent applications, not a measure of technology news, but a proxy for technology news, that we are completely aware of the fact that patent applications are not by themselves are not a great measure of technology news. But you're very right that if there is a smart way of looking at some text analysis and extracting more news content on it, I think that would work. I'm aware that, so I actually remembered one thing. There's a very recent paper by Tarek Hassan. He looks into quarterly earning calls. He did that for different reasons as well. But one of the recent papers actually looks into those and checks the patent references in quarterly earning calls to get to the 20 biggest innovations in the US in the past decades. So I couldn't remember off the top of my head because this is a very recent paper of a couple of months maybe. And I can send it to you for sure. But that is the only one now I can think of for the text analysis.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, sure, of course. All right, so let me tell you how the rest of the talk is going to be. Let me also check the time. I'm going to tell you how we construct the instrument. And then we're going to put this instrument into a test in a smallish VAR, which is going to only have 5 variables. And then if time permits, I'm going to tell you the results in a larger VAR that we incorporate as 16 variables. So the construction of the patent-based instrument for the technology news shocks relies on the data coming from US Patent and Trademark Office. And we call this a novel data set, which is very novel because once we started working on this, we realized that it was very difficult to find good quality patent application data. Although you might think it should go without saying, but it wasn't very easy to find at least higher frequency data than annual data. Until 2015, Marco and his co-authors in USPTO wrote this paper and basically published the data set from 1981 to 2014. This data set is monthly flow of patent applications, patent abandonments, granted patents. There is a historical golden version of this if you want to trace the life cycle of a patent. So it's a big undertaking, but if you are really keen on doing more work on patent data, I would definitely suggest you look into that. And these patents are called utility patents. They're also referred to as patents for innovation. So those are the ones that we are looking at. And we are only looking at patent applications. Granted patents for us, they have already exhausted their term to give us the news content. So we only focus on patent applications, although we are fully aware of the fact that not all patents are granted at the end, but still there is some news component in those applications. And this data gives us a sectoral classification of these patent applications. So here it is. We aggregate this monthly data to quarterly because our VAR is also quarterly. When you look at this data, in the beginning, we normalize it to 0 so you can see the trend in different sectors a bit easier. The steepest trend is on computers and communications from the early 80s. I mean, I think most of us would expect that. The second largest sector is electrical and electronics in purple. And in yellow, we see drugs and medical. These enjoyed the fastest trends in the past. And if you look at the errors that I just put on your screen, there are blips in the data. These are very short-lived, and I'm going to talk to you about them in a second. These are regulatory changes, which we keep in the data because they're not enacted as an action to the macroeconomy or business cycles. They were purely for regulatory reasons. And if you look at the shaded areas, which clearly gives us the MBR recession periods, you will see some of an evidence that there is some cyclical behavior in patent filing, especially in the global financial crisis on the right one. You'll see that the patent applications go down. And this is very apparent in computer and communication part, because if your company is closing down or if you're really struggling to pay your employees, patenting your products is not your first priority. So we definitely need to do something about patent application data. We cannot use that in raw form. These regulatory changes that I mentioned, those 3 blips, are really important for us. The first one didn't create as much of a fuzz as the other 2. The first one was in 1982. It was basically an abolishment of an old patenting court and the establishment of a new one. And the idea behind that was that they wanted to extend protection against infringement. One important thing about these regulatory things, clearly they are happening to improve transparency in patenting process, they are happening because regulatory authorities observe some sort of fraudulent or strategic behavior in patenting process. And what happens is that clearly you have a bit of a news before these regulations are in play. And there is some strategic filing of patents before these actually start happening in the economy. So in the second one, for example, which was enacted in 1995, but it was already agreed on in 1994, it's called TRIPS agreement, and it brought a lot of people and from countries together. And these countries said, we need to harmonize our patenting rules, because if you have a product that you developed in Europe, it's not subject to the same rules in the US. So they had to harmonize these patenting rules. But there were two big implications of this TRIPS agreement that urged inventors to immediately file before this regulation be enacted in 1995. First, before this regulation change happened, once you file your application, you could hold your patent for 17 years after it was granted. So people were urged to keep application to granting process as long as they could to make more advancement in their production. And some of these patents are called submarine patents. If you don't provide the USPTO, the regulatory paperwork that is required for your patent to be granted, and you keep this process to 10 years, it gives you kind of the market power to make sure that you are the only producer of this particular product. But if this agreement did something quite smart, and they basically said, once you file your patent, you only have 20 years from filing to keep the patent and capitalize on it. So it is in your best interest to get this process done as soon as possible and get your granted patent. And on the other hand, this agreement increased the transparency of patenting process. Back in the day, until your patent was granted, your product was secret. Now it is, unless you have a very good reason, your patent is completely public after 18 months of filing, even if it's not granted at that point. And if you look at the regulatory documents, the regulatory document actually says that this agreement was done to foster technological innovation. And that's why it is an important one that we're definitely keeping in the data. And the third one is just a definition of patent ownership. It's not first to invent anymore. Since 2013, it's first to file. So if you think you invented the same product, you rush into filing your patent before this act comes in place, because you would like to be the first one to file at that point. Going forward, again, these three we are definitely keeping, because we have some sensitivity analysis around those, but these provide us an exogenous variation in the patent data. And now, after all this preamble, I can tell you how we actually construct the instrument. What we do is we aggregated the monthly patent data into quarterly, and now we take the quarterly growth rates of this. This is PAT on the left-hand side. And we regress that on an intercept and 4 of its lags to get rid of some autocorrelation. And we also use survey of professional forecasters 1 quarter and 4 quarter ahead expectations on the list of these variables. So this is unemployment, inflation, real non-residential investment, and real net corporate profits. We can extend this list. We played around with this. We don't want to put a lot of variables in here and end up with degrees of freedom issues. These are the 4 that we think are definitely capturing the pre-existing expectations that we would like to capture. We also add the contemporaneous values and up to 2 lags of some policy changes. These are Römer and Romer type monetary policy changes, and Römer and Romer and Martens and Raven type unexpected and expected tax policy changes. And at the end of this regression, the residual ZT is our main instrumental variables to use. We have a lot of coefficients and a lot of statistics, but I just wanted to show you one main table with these. If you look at the Wold test for joint significance, for pre-existing believes 1 quarter ahead, pre-existing believes 1 year ahead, and policy shocks, they're all meaningfully contributing to the patent application growth in quarterly frequency. And all controls are all definitely jointly significant. Once we repeat some Granger causality test on ZT by looking at the lagged states of the economy by basically extracting factors from a large US data set and then running Granger causality tests, we don't find any evidence that the instrument is Granger caused by anything. But I'm going to definitely skip those results. And how does this instrument look like? In gray dashed dotted line, you're seeing the left-hand side variable. It's not purged, it's just the quarterly growth rate of patent applications. And in green, you see only the instrument that is cleaned for its lags and only for the SPF. So basically, this last part of the equation is missing. We don't consider at that point the policy changes. That is the green line. And if we consider the policy changes, just completely this run this regression, this univariate regression, and take ZT, this is the blue line. And blue line is shorter than the other two because we only have Romer and Romer narrative monetary policy changes until the end of 2006. But we also repeat our results by using the green line that is orthogonal to SPF, and results are very similar. And now I can put this instrument to a test in a small VAR by checking the time, all right? But before getting to that, I would like to tell you any identifying assumptions we have. Just these are the last equations, I promise. And in these equations, the first one is giving you the equation for the technological process. So if AT is the technological process, it has two components, the stationary component ST and gamma as the permanent component. And stationary component is quite easy. It has an AR1 process with an innovation E1 that is innovation to current technology. Gamma, that is the permanent component, has a unit root because it is the permanent component. So in first differences, it is composed of by the steady state of technology, steady state growth rate of technology, an AR1 term, and another innovation that we deeply care for here, E2. And in the previous studies, this lag over here, K, was assumed to be bigger than 0. In other words, that means that agents learn about the shock before it hits, meaning again, namely that new shocks are orthogonal to current productivity. In our work, we are allowing this to be bigger than or equal to 0, which basically means that current new shocks don't have to be orthogonal to current technology. And that is, in a way, in our case, intuitive because you are applying for your patent, but in the meantime, you can actually roll out your product under the patent pending status. You don't need to have a granted patent to produce your work and already start selling it. So that's why it is crucial for us to get rid of this strong assumption that new shocks are orthogonal to current technology, but we allow it. And that basically in words says that news arrives along with and signaled by innovations in current technology, and technology diffuses slowly into the economy. And empirically, what we do is basically, it's very simple. It's a two-stage VAR estimation in the sense we have a VAR, first a 5-variable VAR and then a 16-variable VAR. We run this VAR, we get the reduced form VAR innovations, which are U hat. And our only assumption is that these U hats, our VAR innovations, and our instrumental variable ZT correlate via this E2, which is the new shock. And then once we do is we project these residuals onto the IV. This is basically what we are used to doing in any IV setting. And we isolate the variation due to this new shock via our IV. So we are after isolating one shock, and we are only isolating the impulse response functions of all the variables in the VAR by using the correlation of VAR innovations and the instrumental variable. I hope this part is clear because I'm not planning to go into any other details on the VAR estimation, but I would like to show you the results. So please interrupt me if you need more explanation on this. Our VAR, the first one, the one that we test our IV in, is a small one. It has only 5 variables in it. And these 5 variables are very carefully chosen because in the previous studies, I mentioned Baudry and Portier, for example. Baudry and Portier only has TFP and stock market index. It's a bivariate VAR. Basu and Kimball, Kurman and Otrok, and others, they extend these VARs by considering some other real variables. For example, real GDP per capita, real consumption per capita, and hours worked. So we carefully selected these variables to have a combination of the variables that we really deeply care for to put this IV into a test. And it is an unrestricted VAR in log levels. Our estimation sample is 71 to 2016. An identification sample is starting from 82 because we use 4 lags to clean the instrument. And until 2006, this is when the Romer and Romer monetary policy changes end. A bit of a health warning before the next slide. We are doing a very major revision of the paper. Although the VARs and everything will stay the same, and intuition and the interpretation of our results are going to stay the same, some of the numbers and some of the quantitative results that I'm going to show you in a second will change a bit because we're extending the data almost for 15 years due to explaining some other things. We are, for example, substituting this NASDAQ, which is more technologically biased, to a larger, longer stock market index, which is Dow Jones. Here are the results, finally. So,
Sinem, if I can just ask, so if the Romer and Romer is limiting your sample, so why don't you use other monetary policy shock variables that would have a longer sample? I mean, you obviously, I mean, you know, I'm going to talk about the high frequency one.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we could definitely, we tried at some point, and also at some point, somebody actually told us that Romer and Romer narrative monetary policy changes were extended to 2009 by some others. We haven't done that because once we learned about these things, the paper was already out. That's the first very honest reason. The second reason is that I showed this chart where we don't even use any policy changes over here with the green line, and the results are very similar. So in a way, the results are not that sensitive to using additional years of data. But we are definitely looking into extending the time span of the identification for sure. That's a very good point, and that's definitely in our to-do list for the revisions, Helene. Thank you. And in the results, let's start with how new shocks affect TFP, which is clearly a key variable for us. And in TFP, what we observe is that TFP doesn't meaningfully move in the first at least 3 to 4 years, depending on your favorite credible set, which is AD 68 for the darker shades, 90% credible set for the in the lighter shades. Whichever you pick, you'll see that technology diffuses slowly, so there's a bit of an S shape, but there's not much action going on in the first years. In response to that, however, stock market is very quick at pricing in this new shock, which is here on the bottom right middle. It immediately jumps on impact, and it already starts moving very significantly before TFP started moving significantly. And while this is happening, the real variables, real GDP, real consumption already started moving. Real consumption already jumps up on impact and increases steadily until 4 to 5 years and stays there. Same thing for GDP. It already reaches its peak in the first 3 years, and hours already reached their peak in the first 3 years. So the main message I would like to get across here is the following. Although we didn't assume that TFP is muted on impact and new shocks are orthogonal to current productivity, this is not our assumption. It instead becomes our result. This is what we observe without putting any restrictions on TFP. And other variables already start moving by depicting business cycle type co-movements. So we think our IV lends some evidence in favor of the news-driven business cycles. And we clearly compared our results to some of the existing ones. The first one is Baudry and Portier one, that they had a bivariate VAR. They assumed that the current TFP is orthogonal to new shocks, but clearly maybe a long-run driver of productivity. And Barsky and Sims in 2011, they are actually on the other side of the facet. They are against this, this hypothesis. They assume that technology new shocks are those that maximize the forecast area variance, the share of productivity. And what we do here is, you see our results in blue, and the shades are our own shades. These are the same ones that I showed you in the previous slide. We run their work by using our data and then overlap the charts. You'll see that there is not much of a difference between our results. The only thing that you're going to see over here is actually their assumption that the TFP impact in purple and green is 0. And in ours, it is 0, although we haven't assumed that. And we have different robustness checks around this as well. And now I would like to tell you a bit more about variance shares. So clearly, one of the hooks in the literature is to check what kind of shares of variances are explained by new shocks. And the assumption that majority uses, like Barsky and Sims, they say, we don't know what kind of share these shocks explain, but we know that they're the longer term drivers of productivity. So they assume for their identification that the maximum forecast area variance, maximum forecast area variance is achieved only via the new shock. And here, this is an area variance decomposition in frequency domain. And I'm going to show you the time domain in a second. How you read these charts is the following. The right-hand side of the charts is short-term, that is up from 1 year to 2 years. The shaded area is business cycle frequencies between 8 to 32 quarters. And then the left-hand side part is the longer term, which is up to 100 years. So, and the variance shares are those that are under the area under the blue line. And if you look into TFP, the area under the blue line for the short term on the right-hand side is very small. And the same thing holds almost for the business cycle frequencies, but the main action is actually on the longer term. So new shocks are more influential in explaining longer term TFP. When you look at other variables, you are going to see a different story. For example, for real GDP, new shocks are a main contributor to the variance shares of GDP in the short term and in the medium term in business cycle frequencies, and for other variables as well. Now look at the same thing in the time domain, sorry. When in the time domain, what we have seen in the previous charts mainly hold. In the TFP, there is not much action coming from the shock in the shorter term, but then the variance share starts increasing afterwards. When you look at real GDP, real consumption, you'll see that there's a steady increase, almost up to 80% in 12 years' time. And for real consumption, almost a 90% share being explained by new shocks in 12 years' time. And for ours and NASDAQ, these are very large shares of variance explained by only one shock. That brings me to my following argument. Although a 5-variable VAR is a very good test for us to check the validity of our instrument and compare our results with past studies, there are 2 problems associated with that. First, we are assuming with the 5-variable VAR that it is representative of the economy, so it is informationally sufficient. It is up to some extent true. 5 variables is not it's not a negligible number of variables, but that informational insufficiency, potential insufficiency, also brings along a problem that most of these variables do have unit roots. And unit roots, although they don't cause much of a problem in the impulse response functions beyond the persistency of impulse responses, they can very easily distort the construction of area variance decompositions. And that brings us to our desire to extend this 5-variable VAR to a larger VAR to check how these shocks transmit to the wider economy. And that's what I'm going to do now after checking the time. Okay, hopefully I can finish in the next 5 to 7 minutes. So we have a very similar VAR setting. We have the same estimation sample of 71 to 2016. It's a VAR with 4 lags. It's a quarterly VAR. Same identification sample from 82 to 2006. But now we have 16 variables. And some variables you already recognize. We have TFP, we have output, consumption, and hours, but now they're joined by investment and capacity utilization, and we call these quantity variables. We also have price variables. These are GDP deflator, real wages, relative price of investment. We have some financial variables. We already had stock market index. Now we add short-term rate. This is a 1-year treasury rate. And term spread, that's the difference between 10 and 1-year treasury rates. And corporate bond spread, that's the spread between BAA and AAA. And we also add expectation variables. These are consumer and business confidence variables. Most of these variables are taken from Fred, except for clearly TFP and a couple others. And the last ones are taken from the Michigan Survey of Consumers. Once we repeat this analysis with the 16 variable VAR, what we observe for TFP is, again, very similar. We have an S shape in the beginning, slow diffusion of technology into the economy. TFP doesn't meaningfully move for a fair amount of time, and then it starts moving. You'll see that there's a less of a persistence in the impulse response function, in contrary to what I've shown in the 5 variable VAR, because we got rid of unit roots by just adding more information into the VAR, but this doesn't really change any interpretation. Now we look at the results in quantities, starting from real GDP. Although there is a bit of a contraction in the beginning of the IRFs, real GDP goes up. Real consumption, again, shoots up on impact, stays high. Real investment, this is not a very significant result, but there is, after a very short-lived contraction, it rises. Hours worked is an important variable for us, because remember, I've talked to you about the co-movement of real consumption and hours worked in coming up with the evidence for news-driven business cycles. If they co-move in the same direction, then it is kind of evidence that these kind of shocks are setting off business cycle type movements. But now I'm showing you actually that there's a significant contraction in hours worked, and I will get to that if I have time. So just please hold on to that thought for a second. But in general, hours also reverse, and then they start going up. Capacity utilization goes up, and R&D expenditures as a share of GDP also go up. Now, if we think about the, I have been talking about the error variances, the decomposition, and the variance shares for quantities basically show us a very similar picture to what I've shown you before, with some quantitative differences. In the frequency domain for TFP, again, there's not much action happening in the shorter term and business cycle frequencies, but most of the action is happening on the left-hand side when we're talking about very long run effect of new shocks in tech and TFP. The time domain concurs this message. When it comes to real consumption in hours, there is clearly more of an explanatory power of new shocks in shorter and medium term, and you can see that the same thing in time domain. But rather than getting numbers as a variance share of 80 to 90%, now you see more modest shares being explained by the new shocks. For example, for real consumption, it is around 20% in 60th quarter. For hours, on average, is 15%. Again, remember the following. I'm not saying that this shock is not important. This shock is very important because we have 16 variables in the VAR. If one shock is explaining 20% of one variable or another, this is still a very sizable shock. I'm just telling you that these are maybe more realistic representation of how much of this shock should explain in reality. And going forward quickly, this shock is disinflationary. GDP deflator goes down. We tried the same thing with different measures of inflation. Price of investment, which is the price of investment goods with respect to consumption goods, it starts going down. That means that investment is becoming cheaper than consumption goods. And real wages, due to some rigidities, there's some contraction in the beginning, but it starts going up. And the variance shares show that some variables are clearly explained more in the shorter term, like real wages, by the shock, versus others are more explained by the shock in the longer term, for example, price of investment. And shortly on the asset prices and consumer confidence, given this shock is disinflationary, monetary authority clearly acknowledges that and responds by reducing the interest rates. So this is the contraction happening over here in the short rate. And with the change in this shorthand, term spread goes up because it is basically the difference between long and this short rate. And as I've shown you in the small VAR, stock market is very quick in pricing in the new shock, which is NASDAQ shooting up. And corporate bond spread on the right bottom doesn't really do much. I wanted to leave these two to the end: consumer confidence and business conditions. These variables are important variables that were used by others in similar studies. And other studies show that these variables actually go up on impact because it is a favorable shock. But we consistently and very robustly find that these variables first go down on impact, but reverse in a very short period of time, 1 to 2 quarters time. And I will tell you why. Remember, I told you that hours contract in the beginning, right over here. And this is a significant finding. Now, what we do in our 16 variable VAR is we take hours out and we put unemployment rate and labor participation into the VAR as the components of hours worked. And we add a 17th variable, which is the 1 year ahead expectations of unemployment rate. And what we find is that this new shock doesn't change anything in labor participation, however, increases unemployment rate. And with this increase in the unemployment rate, and remember, hours worked already went down, real wages already went down, there is the expectation of unemployment goes up very significantly to 5 percentage points. And when you look at the variance shares in the frequency domain, you'll see that these variables are quite significantly affected by the shock and business cycle frequencies, short and business cycle frequencies. So this basically brings me to my very earlier comment that there's some heterogeneity in assessing the impact of these shocks. Financial markets and the real economy are very quick in understanding that these are favorable news. However, consumers' responses overweigh the current economic conditions, which is basically their wages are going down. Maybe they think that they're going to be replaced by robots with the arrival of new technology. And that's why, and with unemployment rate going up, they revise their expectation on the negative side at first, but then they quickly learn that this is a favorable news event, and that's why it is actually a favorable shock. That brings me to the end with 6 minutes remaining. Let me use the last minute for the conclusions. In this paper, we are introducing an instrumental variable to identify a specific shock, which is technology new shocks. And to be able to get to that instrument, we're using patent applications because we think there's some information in patent application that gives us some news about technological innovation that's going to happen in the future. And this IV enables us to refrain from making very strong classical identifying assumptions that were made in previous studies. And once we do that, what we find is that technology new shocks can definitely induce some business cycle type movements. In some cases, it's a bit delayed. For example, these news affect TFP only with a substantial delay, 4 to 6 years. However, in anticipation of future productivity increase, quantities already start rising with these positive news. And there's an important role of the labor market because there is some heterogeneity coming from consumers' side of not being able to process the information behind new shocks. These shocks are accounting for a sizable share of business cycle fluctuations. I didn't put it into numbers. I showed you many charts, I know. But to give you a sense, in business cycle frequencies, they account for 15% of consumption variation, 10% of investment and output, and 15% of unemployment and hours. And again, these are based on, these numbers are based on the 16 variable VAR. So these are not negligible numbers. And at the end, there is some informational friction happening in the responses. Financial markets are very quick in understanding what's going on and pricing in the news on impact. However, consumers take a bit longer, slightly a bit longer time to react. And that brings me to the end. Thank you very much for your attention.